So, welcome to everybody. I'm Bob Pozen. I used to be Vice Chairman of Fidelity, and I teach 2 corporate governance courses here at Sloan. And today we're going to talk about boards with an emphasis on the role of corporate directors vis-a-vis the CEO and the power relationships. And we have a great panel here to discuss this. We have 3 distinguished Sloan alumni, all of whom are directors on multiple companies. Sandy Heaton, to my right immediately, director of Principal Group and previously Lexmark. Dennis Kass, a director of Legg Mason and Wendy's. And Terry Stone, a director of AIG and previously Duke Energy. Their bios are in the materials, so I'm not going to take a lot of time to do that. All I can say is they're all very knowledgeable and very distinguished, and they've promised me that we'll have a lot of fun today. So here's how we're going to organize this session. Each of the 3 panelists will talk for 5 or 6 minutes, and then the other panelists will comment a little, and after all 3 have spoken, we'll open this up to Q&A. And so we'll have plenty of time for that. Sandy is going to begin by talking about her experience in coming on the board and focusing on the Nominating and Governance Committee, how directors are selected, since we think some of you might want to learn how to get on boards, and also how boards go about looking at CEO succession and some other issues. So without further ado, I'm going to give it to Sandy.
Thanks, Bob, and it's great to be back here at Sloan. It's been a while. I thought that I might start out by just talking about the Nominating and Governance Committee and what they do and how they go about it. And their primary function is really to make sure that we have the right people on the board and that the board is performing and that there is succession planning, so it's not just the right people today, but we have a plan for how we will be staffing the board over a 3 to 5 year period. And so many people wonder, well, what are they looking for in terms of directors? And it sort of rolls back to what is the role of the board. And the role of the board, in short, is to be ensuring the long-term value creation and the continuing support for the stakeholders of the corporation, which means approving the strategy. It means assessing the level of risk that's being undertaken and making sure that that's appropriate, monitoring the execution of the strategy and the performance, assessing the CEO, and evaluating and compensating accordingly, and then making sure that all of the regulatory requirements of the corporation are being satisfied. So that's the context for which the Nominating and Governance Committee thinks about who do we want to add to the board. And I'm not currently on a Nominating and Governance Committee, but I was on the Nominating and Governance of Covance until a couple of years ago when the company was sold. And 20 years ago, I was on a Nominating and Governance Committee for Lucan Steel. And it's very different today than it was then. It's a formal process. We go through those responsibilities and lay out what are the key things that we need to do for the regulatory side. So we have to have financial experts. We have to have people with experience in CEO and executive compensation. We need people who are experts in risk management. But then we need people who have C-suite experience, either present or past, and who have the experience that's relevant for not just what the company is doing today, but what the company is going to be doing over the next 5 to 10 years, whether they might be moving from domestic to global, or they might be digitizing their business, or whatever. And so typically today, there's a grid that's laid out, and we map what the current directors have relative to those skills and attributes, and who's going to be retiring when, because now there are mandatory retirement ages, and start the process of saying, what do we need to do in the way of profiles of individuals to add to the board over the next 2 to 3 years. The nominating committee is really the gateway for coming into the board They also, in many companies, the ones I've been associated with, have very rigorous evaluation processes, not only for how is the board operating as a group, but individual directors. And there's typically a third-party assessment and a conversation with the directors before they are put up for renomination to make sure that they know what they're doing well and what they aren't, and in extreme cases, not asked to come back on the board again. So those are some of the parameters. I think the other thing that's really important is the softer side, and that is you really need a group of people who are not only expert, have great experiences, and are individually good contributors, but they need to understand the balance with management, and that they may be accustomed to being in the CEO role and very much in charge of things. As a director, they're not in charge of anything except deciding maybe that the CEO needs to be replaced. But they are really managing through influence. And so that can be a little different role for someone who may have been a successful executive but might not be such a good board member. And the third thing is really the interaction among and between the board members and the board members in management. And that's something that's hard to assess until you bring somebody into the boardroom. But generally, the boards have processes for interviewing candidates that can pretty much sniff out whether that's going to work or it isn't going to work. So that's the nutshell.
One more minute.
I think I'll defer now to Dennis.
Well, I think we'd like comments from other people about how they got on boards and how this process works. So maybe Dennis and then Terry can talk about it.
Great.
And in responding to your question, I think I'll end up commenting a little bit on what Sandy described. I think you described a high-performing board. And the reality is that the corporate landscape consists of boards that function well and those that struggle for a variety of reasons. And in fact, the latter is probably what has opened the door to the surge of activism, which is on a curve that probably is still sort of rising and accelerating. Boards are social organisms. And for all the things that Sandy described with respect to ideal board functioning, and I think you really did lay out a board that or perhaps two, that at least with respect to nominating governance committee are doing it all right, complicate. These social factors absolutely complicate doing those things well. Hardest thing for a board is self-assessment. And while many boards on paper have processes that are designed to generate candid assessments of committees and of the full board and of individuals. One thing that you cited, which is the utilization of that kind of information for purposes of deciding which board members will be renominated, is more often spoken of than practiced in a rigorous fashion.
I was going to ask, some people would argue we have mandatory retirement only because the boards are unwilling to kick off somebody who's not really contributing. Of course, you can kick somebody off if they don't show up at meetings. But if they just aren't contributing, it's been a rare instance for somebody. And I'm personally against mandatory retirement, especially as I get older.
I'm with you.
I think part of it's just that the unwillingness to bite the bullet on the difficult people.
It's very
because
hard.
you have some people at 73 are great directors, and some people at 60 are terrible directors.
Absolutely.
It's
very hard.
Aside from mandatory retirement, there are really only two alternatives. One is an evaluation process with teeth, and that is aspirational for most boards today, I would say. The other is term limits. And GE, for example, just recently instituted term limits. So
term limits would be like you can only serve for 10 years or for 12 years.
What we think politicians should have.
In the UK, the rule is
9 years.
9 years, and then you are presumptively not independent.
That's
after
correct.
9 years.
And in fact, that idea is beginning to transport to the United States. I know the Council of Institutional Investors has adopted a policy with respect to board tenure. I think deeming a director to be at the 9-year point no longer independent and actually
presumptively.
Yeah, exactly. No,
Less,
exactly right.
yeah.
Exactly right. And requiring some explanation if the
right.
director's going to remain. And so that may end up making an improvement. But
Let's have Terry
I'll
comment.
just describe a very well-functioning evaluation process, because I've been on a lot of boards, and the one I'm on right now has a process that I think is really fantastic and surprisingly good.
But these are large companies that you've been on.
These are all large companies,
Yeah.
and this is AIG, so it's a very big company. So our process, we don't use a third party. The head of the Nominating and Governance Committee makes a phone call to each member of the board once a year, and says anything you'd like to say about board process, anything that you're not happy with, anything you think we're really doing well, and other activities or behaviors by board members that you want to comment upon, either really great or problematic. And taking all that information into account, board members get a call back later. If you don't get a call, it's the good news. But board members do get calls saying, a fair number of people on the board think that you just really talk too much. Or a fair number of people on the board think that they loved what they hear from you, but you just don't speak up enough. And it actually has been, it has worked really well. And also, in instances where people simply haven't participated as fully as they need to on this kind of a very rigorous board, there have been instances of asking people not to stand for re-election again.
So I want to ask Terry, and then other people can chime in. So the first board I got in on, which was many years ago, I won't say how many, but I met the CEO and a director, and the CEO asked me to be on the board.
Correct.
But after that, I always met independent directors first, and only met the CEO. Right. So in the boards you're involved with, are you hiring a formal search firm? How are you going about the process?
It has been a complete evolution. I've been on boards for probably 30 years, 35 years, and in the early times, it was the CEO found out about you. Indeed, my first board was because of Sloan. I was working in New Jersey, and a Sloan grad called the office here and said that they wanted someone with financial services expertise in that area to be on a mortgage bank that Lou Ranieri was setting up. And they gave him my name, and I met with the CEO, and he put me on the board. That would never happen today on any board that I know about. At AIG, our board candidates don't even meet the CEO. It's all done by the Nominating and Governance Committee. They make their decisions with the aid of a search committee trying to find candidates. Search committees are helpful in rigor and process. I think generally I find that they're risk averse and they don't really seek out a range of candidates. So I think the board members still are very instrumental in developing ideas for the search committee, for the Nom and Gov committee. So networking really does cause things to happen. In my case, I haven't gotten on a single board where there wasn't a board member or a CEO who didn't know me in advance. So the third party part works sometimes, but in my case, it was always, there was a CEO on a board that I was the CFO of, and they asked me to go on their company's board. In the case of AIG, someone had known me from my investment banking career who was the head of Nom and Gov, and so she got my name in the pool.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to give Dennis a chance to talk. Dennis is going to focus on the role of board in setting overall strategy, which is in many cases one of the most important functions of the board, and one that raises questions about where the board stops and the CEO starts.
So strategy is one of the toughest things for boards to get their arms around. And the reason that is the case is because boards spend most of their time on things other than strategy. Remember that the board's responsibilities are anchored in oversight, and oversight, to a great extent, has to do with monitoring and evaluation, focusing on operations and focusing on financial performance. And what's more, boards meet 4 to 6 times a year and are absolutely deluged with information in preparation for every meeting, sometimes 1,000 pages. It can happen.
Easy.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And however diligent you are, I don't know of many boards or many managements that supply information sufficiently far in advance that you're going to be nearly as far up the curve as management is by the time the meeting comes. And managements have an objective of their own, which is not only to perform, but to look good. And these are normal human tendencies. We should expect them to occur. They do. And so that means that when the board meets, it is in a position of severe information asymmetry versus management. And you know, the modern corporation has become complexified by lots of factors, not the least of which, as another director mentioned to me recently, is that we're all in the same business, which is tech, just in different industries. And if you look at the average age of board members today, which in the United States is 63, most of them did not grow up in the digital economy. In fact, none of them did. And so that means that so many of the strategic cross currents that boards are needing to consider are somewhat beyond the experience set of some of the people who are serving on boards. So with that as a preface, strategy is hard for boards to engage in a meaningful way. And what's more, boards don't develop strategy. They shouldn't. The responsibility of setting strategy is management's. It's management's to propose, and in a certain sense, it's for the board to dispose. But the predisposition of boards generally, and this is sociocultural as much as it is a function of what boards are in a capacity to do, is to defer to the CEO and the management team. It's really hard for a board member to claim unless that person is a deep industry expert, and there always should be and are a few of those on boards of directors, but not exclusively. The attitude of the board is to be as discriminating as they can in consuming and processing that information, but more often putting themselves in a position of support as strategy is executed over a period of time, being sure that the proper incentives are in place and that they are making the proper judgments about
So Dennis, I was going to ask you, so strategy is a big thing. So I like to think of strategy in two buckets. One is what I call business strategy, which is how your products and this. But then there is the area of, let's just call it capital allocation. And I'm a great advocate, and I've just written a piece in the CFO magazine about why boards need to have finance committees as well as audit committees. The audit committee is totally overwhelmed by
it's the wrong committee for that purpose.
Small stuff. But that aspect of strategy, which is how much money goes to shareholders and dividends and share buybacks as opposed to reinvest in the company. That seems to me an area where directors need to take a more initiating role than the question of business strategy.
Well, so return of capital versus reinvestment of capital is the fundamental subdivision with respect to capital allocation. But the tougher problem is, if the question is which projects to invest in, how is the board to be in a position to help management determine whether those are the right bets, determine whether they're properly sized and in proper relationship to the risk that company should be prepared to bear, and that involves an assessment of what your shareholders have invested in you to do. So, I mean, the long and short of it is capital allocation is inextricably connected to strategy. I think it actually ends up being, for the reasons I just cited, one of the harder ones for the board to grapple with, at least in terms of really being able to make a substantive contribution to management judgment. But yeah, I agree with that, but others would have a view on this. Terry?
Well, you know, at AIG, we have not only first of all, I think most boards think that strategy has to be the whole board.
Yeah.
So there's never, in my experience, a strategic committee, a strategy committee.
Correct.
So the whole board really has to be engaged with that. So then the questions of how do you subdivide some of the other things into committee responsibilities. We have an audit committee, which does all the things that audit does, which is very lot of work. And then we have a risk and capital committee. So the risk part of it is assessing, risk appetites, whether we're complying with them, what they should be, that sort of thing. And then the capital allocation, how much capital do we have?
That's like a finance committee.
How much do we need?
Yeah.
It's like a finance committee, exactly. And indeed, we're under pressure from the Federal Reserve to split risk from capital.
I see.
And to have yet another committee, which we managed to not have to do by putting the word risk before capital. We were putting capital and risk, and we did risk and capital, and that
It solved it, huh? Why not?
But these are two huge topics.
Yeah.
But you just there's only so many committees you can have.
Sandy, you want to comment?
Well, yes, I think there's an intermediate strategic point and capital allocation point, and that is the portfolio of businesses that you're in.
Sure.
And from my experience, boards get very involved in both the question of how much do you return to shareholders and in what form versus investing in the business, and how do you allocate capital to the various businesses that you may be in today, or you may need to disinvest in one and go into another if you're really trying to create value long term. And it is very hard to find the time to both understand enough to give wise input and to have the discussion on it. But one of the things that's happened in my companies has been strategic retreats that are set aside to really have time when the board focuses on nothing but strategy, on what are the options that are before us, what are the long-term implications for value creation, and the risk profiles of different alternatives.
And I think most boards now will have one of the meetings a year dedicated to strategy.
Absolutely.
It will usually be a 2-day session rather than a 1-day session. We want to make sure Terry gets a chance here to talk about a very interesting aspect of being on a board, which is what happens when you come into conflictual situations. Terry has dealt with a number of them and may be willing to share some of that.
Yeah, I tend not to be someone who likes conflict, but
She doesn't look like a boxer.
you don't get to choose what's going to happen. You have a responsibility when you take on these board things that through thick or thin, you're going to do what needs to be done. So I guess probably I was involved with probably the most one of the most extreme corporate governance events that has happened probably in the last decade, which is I was on the board of Progress Energy, which is a big public utility headquartered in Raleigh, North Carolina, with operations in other states. And we ultimately decided that we were going to merge with Duke Energy, which was also headquartered in North Carolina and with operations in other states. And although in concept, you just run the numbers, it makes so much sense, it never happened because of the so-called social issues. The social issues means who's going to be the CEO. And it just turned out that the stars were aligned at a certain point because the CEO of Duke was reaching retirement age, and the CEO of Progress, our company, was a sort of real, very, very highly respected 45-year-old high-performing CEO. So we were actually approached by Duke Energy about doing a merger with our CEO being the final, the CEO after the deal. So that kicked off a long series of negotiations. Finally, we decided to do it. If you're in a regulated utility like this, you really are partners with your regulators. So went through all the things with the regulators. They liked this management lineup. We made agreements about who was going to be on the ultimate board. We were the smaller company, so we got fewer people than the other. Was a sort of 60-40 split. But we got half the committee chairs, and I was audit chair, and I was going to be audit chair for the combined company going forward. All this was finally gotten through the regulators. We finally got it closed, and we needed to have a, if you will, administrative kind of board meeting in which we agreed and voted all the things we'd agreed before. Who was going to be the CEO, who was going to be the chair of the audit committee, who was going to be, etc. So since it was just ministerial, we didn't meet in person. We met on a telephonic call. And we had the board meeting, and we approved all the things that we had agreed to. And then at the end, the lead director said that she wanted to call a executive session. Now again, it's executive session, we're all spread all over the country. And executive session is a very good practice, and so everybody said fine. And she opened the executive session 5 minutes after we had just named the CEO, saying that she wanted to remove the CEO and put her former CEO in as CEO. And we're all like, sort of sitting in our beach house wondering what's going on. After a rigorous discussion for a couple of hours about what went wrong, you never told us you didn't like him, what's the story here? I finally said, are you just going to take a vote, because they had 60% of the votes, and move this forward, or is this something that we can, and they said, we'll let you ask as many questions as you want. So a vote was taken and split exactly along 60-40 lines, and the new CEO was removed that afternoon, and another one came in. So then when you're in that position, you have to decide what you're going to do. So our directors all immediately hired very high-quality New York M&A counsel that afternoon. He got off a subway and talked to us, and he very rationally helped us to think through how to ask the questions about how this possibly could have happened to decide what we should do, which we did. We went through a very logical process. He advised us to meet with the lead director and see if there was something that we had missed that we should understand. And ultimately, I decided that I couldn't chair the audit committee with a CEO that I didn't trust, and therefore resigned. So, there are kind of really amazing things that can happen on boards. This was on the lunatic fringe of amazing.
Well, I think that is an amazing story, but I think the whole question of mergers and acquisitions is an area where the board, I think, does have to play a more aggressive role. We know that something, depending on how you count it, 65 to 75% of all mergers and acquisitions are not successful in that, the value, it's successful for the target, but not for the acquirer. So I think that's an area, and I've been in situations where I've objected to a merger, and it's pretty hard because, as you say, Dennis, the CEO is proposing it, but what really gets me is when someone proposes a merger and they say, and we justify this in part on revenue synergies. That's like waving a red flag in front of me.
They don't have it.
Synergy is a word that people use when they have no idea what the actual benefits are. Because if they knew exactly, they would say it. Like, we're going to cut costs or we're going to do this. So to me, coming from the investment industry, when someone comes in and justifies a merger acquisition on synergies, that's, to me, a sign that's not very well thought out. The other thing in mergers and acquisitions, you have to have a good implementation program. And so it's not up to the board to do it, but to make sure that that's executed. So, yours is a very extreme example, but I think that, and maybe Dennis or Sandy, you want to comment on your experience? Dennis?
So this brings us back to the capital allocation discussion.
Right.
Acquisitions are the ultimate capital allocation.
Right.
The fact that the track record is as dismal as you just pointed out, Bob, shows that the underwriting criteria and the rigor of the underwriting process had to have been deficient in some fashion. Otherwise, at least we'd have a 50-50 outcome, one would expect. And yet, for many companies, there is a sense of strategic imperative that without an acquisition, the potential of the company that is acquiring cannot be fully realized. The most important thing for directors to stay focused on is that their job is to create conditions that enable management to drive value creation for shareholders. That means that return on invested capital is something that needs to be thought about by the board in the most demanding fashion. This ends up introducing yet that social issue again. The emphasis that almost inevitably develops within a group of people who have worked together for a long time is on collegiality. And often there are times when it is the most brutal debate that's needed before a board should satisfy itself that it's turned over every stone and that this is a proper transaction to support. So look, we're just spinning some of the complexities here that arise with some of the most important duties for which a board is responsible. And remember as well that boards of directors are not really built. Yeah, I'll let you go. But are not really built for grappling with these kinds of episodic problems. It's not like boards get, generally speaking, experienced in major capital allocation decisions. They don't arise that often.
Right.
So they learn as they go. Pick a brain surgeon who's, you're his first patient or her first patient. You'd probably choose someone else if you could. But boards have to take on whatever's served up.
Sandy?
Well, I think 2 or 3 thoughts on this. One is that comes back to the value of this strategic discussion on a regular basis, to be identifying where what's needed to create greater value for the shareholders is a combination or an acquisition or whatever. And so there's discussion early on, and there's a chance before anybody gets invested in it, who's suddenly fallen in love with this company that we're going to acquire and the thought of being CEO of the big company, that there's a more objective conversation around, what would be the value of it and what would be the conditions and how are we going to assess whether it's the right thing to do or not. I think the other thing that I've seen my boards get involved in is a fairly rigorous post-mortem process for any acquisitions that are done.
Absolutely.
So that, and it's not who are we going to shoot tomorrow morning, but it's what have we learned and how do we embed that in our process going forward for deciding whether we do an acquisition and with whom we do an acquisition. I want to just also comment on a point you made, Terry, about your discomfort with the CEO and deciding to resign. I think that's something that lots of times people don't think about until they have served on boards for a while, and that is that it's just as important to make sure that you are choosing the people you want to be associated with, where you want to put your reputation on the line, right, as whether they're going to want you. Right. And in extreme cases where something happened you hadn't expected and you feel that it's not with your value set, I think you were very courageous and very right to just say, I can't be a part of this any longer.
So these are great comments, and we want to leave time here for questions. So we will take questions from the audience. Anyone? Yes.
One that you all didn't touch on, which is certainly a lightning rod issue, is CEO compensation. So if y'all could talk about the important work of the compensation committee. Certainly in some circles it's been in the crosshairs in a very negative way.
So Dennis happens to be on the compensation committee, I remember, of Lake Mason, right?
Well, and Wendy's as well.
Okay, sorry. So you want to comment on that? I mean, I'll be glad to too.
No, please do. There's been a pattern of upward migration of executive compensation. This is, in a sense, a byproduct of and a reinforcer of the prevalent practice across industries of focusing on median compensation for selected
75th. Everyone is in
it's
the
Lake
75th.
Wobegon.
It is Lake Wobegon.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so, I mean, suffice it to say that the ways in which boards inform themselves about compensation, and often with heavy reliance on compensation consultants who have industry specialization, does in some ways encourage an upward bias. And of course, the demand on the CEO's side is at least to be as well compensated as the next CEO. It may not be uttered in this fashion, but he or she thinks that he or she is better than him or her. And so it takes tremendous discipline for a compensation committee to attempt to get this right.
Yeah. Let me make 2 comments. I agree everything that Dennis says, but
I wasn't even finished.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. I think compensation committee reports are now really critical because that's where the compensation committee explains what it's doing, and the shareholders now cast this advisory board vote. I'm just, another article that I'm about to publish in the Harvard Business Review looks at what are the criteria that are used. And a lot of them are using non-GAAP criteria, not explaining it very well. Non-GAAP, you take out the stock options, even though you're giving this guy stock options. So I'm really against that. The other thing is they're always total shareholder returns relative to a peer group. The question is it the right peer group? Somehow in the financial services industry, Goldman Sachs always shows up in the peer group. And why? It's pretty obvious. So I think that's a critical issue, and it's something institutional shareholders can do something about by asking for better explanation and better criteria. The second thing is, a lot of it depends on how you structure the compensation. If you let people have stock options, and then once they exercise them, they can blow them all out, they're going to have an incentive to go to the top of the market, blow it all out, and not have a long-term perspective. I'm of the view you need to ask the CEO to hang on to half of it so he or she can pay the taxes, but you want this person not to be trying to top out. So a lot of this has to do with the design. But Dennis is right, it's not easy to stand up to a comp in a comp committee. Let's have other questions.
And, okay, just to finish the one point there, it's not easy, but process is critical to assuring a better outcome.
Yes, we have a question here.
Thank you very much. I have a question related to the board oversight performance. Currently, I'm advising CEO who actually got the approval to execute the business model transformation for the organization and got a substantial capital allocation to execute. However, for the past few years, it's not happening well. And right now, it's a little bit of a mess. And what I am kind of wondering about as I work with him and also his management team, I wonder about board oversight.
Board oversight of the carry out
and also it's a risk
this
management
strategic
perspective.
plan?
Exactly, because this is a substantial business model transformation requiring not only capital but also resources.
Well, I just want to say,
Yeah.
I'm always scared when someone tells me they're about to do a transformative acquisition.
But it
I
happened.
like tack-on acquisitions.
However, the board approved,
Yeah.
and the board has been getting an update.
Right.
But right now, the results is not good. So how do you deal with the board performance
Okay, well, I'm
as
going to
oversight?
let Terry. Do you want to take a whack at that?
So to restate the question,
The question is: here's the board has approved a transformative strategy, and it's not going very well. So, what's the role of the board in terms of oversight?
yeah, well, the role of the board of the oversight is to say, okay, what are we going to do? And what are the benchmarks for showing that we're going to get this as good as we can get it, given whatever ditch we're in, and having very, very regular check-ins with management on how they're doing against the benchmarks. And ultimately, if it really hasn't been well executed, you have to decide whether you have the right management team.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So here's a question for you. How much of the stock did the directors own?
Oh, well, that's a different story.
Yeah, that's a new wrinkle right there.
Right.
Not for profit.
Not-for-profit.
Well, I mean, the board has to, somebody on the board, usually the lead director or the non-executive chair, needs to take the role of really maybe reconstituting the board or really holding the board, making sure the board is doing its job. Let's have another question.
Yeah, maybe my question is a continuation. I think Terry talked about how there's a relationship with the CEO often,
Right.
and they bring you into the board.
Well,
You know,
she's saying that was the old style. That's not the new style.
that's not the new preferred style. But
Right.
in a lot of board cases, there is relationship between the board and the executive team. And I was wondering if there's ways to systematically make sure there's sort of healthy tension and conflict between the executive team and the board. And the context is I've moved back to India about 4.5 years ago, and a lot of the boards that either I'm on or my board sort of governing me, it seems to be a reticence of asking some of the hard questions until it almost gets too late. And so the pendulum, at least in Indian companies, is
Well,
swinging crazy.
I'm gonna throw out
So I
an
was just
answer,
wondering,
and
is
then
there a way
we'll-
to systematize?
We'll ask for things. So to me, one of the most important developments has been that most boards now have executive committee meetings without the CEO or management present. And that often happens at a dinner the night before. And I find that directors who have been reluctant to be critical in front of the CEO are much more willing to be candid in that circumstance. So I'm a great advocate of executive sessions. I don't know, Sandy, you want to comment on how else the board can, make sure that it's looking carefully at CEOs?
Well, I think that is a very good vehicle. And usually coming out of those executive sessions, there's an agreed-to set of messages that are going to management, and in some cases, if appropriate, action that's expected and report back to the board. And so that has been a very good vehicle when in the past, we should have been doing it anyway, but it was pretty awkward.
So this goes to Dennis's question about this is collegial group. I've been in boards for 3 years where the person next to me never said a word. Then we had an executive session, and the person became like vociferous about his concerns about the CEO. So I really think there's a lot of social pressure in the board not to say it in front of the CEO, and the executive sessions are really.
Couple points.
Yeah.
First of all, however strong a board is and needs to be, the reality of the CEO mentality is that he or she wants to run the show. Okay, you don't become a CEO. You shouldn't be a CEO unless that is your strong impulse. So that means you have to have tension. You hope you have a racehorse. You hope you have sort of strong enough reins to provide guardrails, and you hope that the board can come together in a proper way to exert pressure when needed. This means that the board needs leadership. If a board does not have a strong lead independent director, it is tough. First of all, lead independent director, tough job. The lead independent director should first be an honest broker, last to speak, and then has the critical role of synthesizing views with the objective of achieving consensus. Because boards really do not want to challenge management with a divided voice. So a lot of this has to do with having the right board. And so to further complicate this conversation, we just made a comment about the mentality of CEOs. I think, respectfully, that the AIG situation of CEO non-involvement is...
I'll correct it. They're involved, but only at the very, very last.
Right, but I don't think that's common. And what's more, and in the United States, this is common. CEOs are chairs of the board, and in addition, there is a lead independent director. CEOs often have, I can tell you Fortune 10 companies where CEOs who are chairs have a huge impact on who's on the board and who's not. So that again heightens the criticality of the board having strong leadership.
As we know, in Canada, in Europe, most of those boards have non-executive chairs.
And I've been the non-executive chair of the company. And that changes the dynamic.
Yeah.
You know, people behave differently.
We have time. Sorry. Yeah.
I was going to say, people behave differently on boards. I've always viewed it as kind of the best way to make my points is to ask questions rather than to make assertions. And I think I've always felt as if you just can't sit through meetings. You have to really ask a lot of questions. And just to really test out, what the answers are going to be, what managers are going to say, and then you make your assessment of whether they're actually on track or not.
Okay, I'd say we have time for one more question.
Yeah, thank you. Just this is a follow-up to the conversation about the CEO. My question is, to what extent at some point the board would actually get involved in the C-suite layer of management beyond the CEO? Specifically speaking, when there is issues. A typical example, 2 months ago, there was a board that just actually had a scandal where the CEO got dismissed just to find out that there was a dysfunction inside. The problem is, I was asked to go and review that board. The problem is, you find out that the board was kept in the dark most of the time, and a lot of the information was held by the gatekeeper, being the CEO, and all of this came to light once he was dismissed after the scandal. Does the board have an end where the board should not get involved anymore in terms of the management layer beyond the CEO?
You want to
Yeah.
address that? Yeah.
Well, what my experience has been is that the board knows very well not only the CEO, but the next level, and sometimes even the level below that. Mm-hmm. And particularly when you have a lot of opportunity to interact socially, for example, at a dinner before the board meeting or whatever, you can end up over time creating the kind of environment where if something is going on, somebody will pick up the phone and call you, and I have experienced that. And then, it takes a lot of trust because you don't want to be sharing where the information came from, but then the director can sort of start a course of inquiry to figure out if there's something going on there that shouldn't be going on.
Usually the board deals with not only the CEO, the CFO, the general counsel, and probably the heads of the largest business units. Second of all, the audit committee, if it runs well, will have private meetings with not only the external auditor, but the internal auditor, and maybe the compliance director. So that's a vehicle for getting at the sort of things you want. So we're running out of time now. We've actually gone 2 minutes over. But I want to thank the three panelists for doing such a great job. And we will, all four of us will stay here for a few minutes if people have other questions that they were not able to ask. So thank you very much, and I hope the rest of your day is successful. Take care.